My wife declared she was not my servant, and my marriage exploded into chaos when I refused to be the provider she had always taken for granted. After a long day of work, I still carried the tension from the office on my shoulders. I expected some semblance of peace, perhaps a quiet dinner, or even just a few moments to sit and let the day slip away. Instead, I was greeted by my wife standing in the middle of the room, arms crossed, looking visibly upset. The air was thick with unspoken words. Before I could ask what was wrong, she blurted out, "I'm not your servant." Her words hit like a slap, not because of their volume, but because of the resentment behind them. I stood there, stunned, trying to piece together what had led to this explosion. Was it the dishes I hadn't washed that morning? The laundry I forgot to fold last weekend? Maybe it was the trash I had promised to take out but didn't. Honestly, I wasn't sure anymore. What I did know was that this wasn't just about a single task I'd overlooked. This had been building for a while. "What do you mean by that?" I asked, trying to stay calm. My tone was measured, but inside I was already defensive. "What do I mean?" She shot back, her voice rising slightly. "Do you even realize how much I do around here? I work, I clean, I cook, I make sure everything is running smoothly. And you?" She paused, gesturing toward me with frustration. "You just assume I'll handle it all." I opened my mouth to respond, but she wasn't finished. "I'm tired of being the one who always has to pick up the slack. You don't even notice how much effort it takes to keep this house together, do you?" Her voice cracked slightly, not from anger but from exhaustion, and that somehow made her words sting even more. I felt the need to defend myself. "Wait a second," I said, stepping forward. "I'm not sitting around doing nothing. I go to work every day to provide for this family. That's not easy either." She scoffed, and that small, dismissive sound lit a fire in me. "Oh, so because you work, you think you're doing enough? Like I don't work too?" Her eyes locked on mine, and for the first time, I realized just how deeply this issue had affected her. She wasn't just angry, she was hurt. The room fell into a tense silence as we stared at each other, both too stubborn to back down. My mind raced, searching for something to say that wouldn't escalate the argument further, but I couldn't find the right words. Finally, she broke the silence. "I can't keep doing this," she said, her voice quieter now but no less firm. "If you think I'm going to act like your personal maid while you just focus on your job, you're wrong." She turned and walked out of the room, leaving me standing there, speechless. I wanted to follow her to explain that she'd misunderstood, but deep down, I knew she hadn't. I sat down on the couch, replaying the conversation in my head, trying to figure out how things had gotten to this point. Had I really been that blind to everything she did? Sure, I noticed when the house was clean or when dinner was ready, but I never stopped to think about how much effort went into those things. I'd taken it all for granted, assuming that as long as I was providing financially, my part of the deal was fulfilled. But her words stuck with me. "I'm not your servant." It wasn't just about household chores, it was about respect, about partnership. At that moment, I realized I might have been falling short in ways I hadn't even considered. As the minutes ticked by, I began to feel less defensive and more introspective. Maybe she was right. Maybe I had been expecting too much from her without realizing it. But even as I acknowledged that possibility, another thought crept in. If she felt that way, why hadn't she said something sooner? Why let it fester until it exploded like this? I stayed on that couch for a long time, thinking about what she'd said and what I could do about it. But as I sat there, something else began to build inside me. A quiet frustration of my own. If she didn't want to feel like a servant, fine, but maybe it was time for her to see what it felt like to be the sole provider. If she thought I wasn't pulling my weight, I'd show her what things would look like if I stopped altogether. And that's when the idea took root. The frustration from our argument had settled into something heavier, a mixture of hurt and defiance. If she felt like her efforts weren't being appreciated, then what about mine? Didn't she see how much I sacrificed to ensure our bills were paid, the house was secure, and our future was stable? By morning, I'd made up my mind. If she thought I was taking her for granted, then maybe it was time for her to see how things looked from my perspective. I wasn't going to argue anymore. I was going to act. She said she wasn't my servant, and I respected that, but I decided I wasn't going to be her provider either. Not out of malice, but to prove a point. Partnerships are built on mutual effort, not one-sided expectations. The first thing I stopped was the little financial extras. Normally I'd cover her share of certain expenses without a second thought, like picking up her phone bill or transferring extra money into our joint account for groceries. This time, I let her handle it. When the first bill came due and she asked if I'd paid it, I simply said, "I figured you'd take care of it." Her raised eyebrow told me she noticed the change. Next, I stopped taking initiative around the house. The trash? I left it. The dishes, I ignored them. Laundry, I let the pile grow. It wasn't long before the cracks began to show. She'd leave for work and come back to the same mess she'd left that morning, while I stuck to my usual routine: work, gym, dinner. If she mentioned the mess, I'd shrug and say, "I thought you didn't want to do everything yourself." At first, she tried to stay ahead of the chaos, tackling the chores on her own with an air of determination. I could see her frustration mounting, but I told myself it was necessary for her to understand my perspective. After all, if I could work all day and still come home to her expectations, why couldn't she? Then came the bigger moves. Usually I'd handle things like scheduling car maintenance, paying insurance premiums, or handling the internet bill. But I let those responsibilities fall to her as well. When she finally noticed the car's expired tags and confronted me, I simply said, "I've been busy, thought you could take care of it." Her reaction was immediate. "Are you serious?" she snapped, her voice brimming with disbelief. "You know I don't have time to deal with all this." "Exactly," I said, keeping my tone calm but firm. "Now you're starting to see how I feel." The tension in her eyes told me she wanted to argue, but she didn't. Instead, she turned on her heel and walked away, muttering something under her breath. It wasn't the reaction I'd hoped for, but it wasn't unexpected either. Over the next few days, the house became a battleground of silent stubbornness. She'd do only the chores she deemed absolutely necessary, and I'd mirror her energy, refusing to step in. The fridge became emptier, the laundry pile taller, and the resentment between us thicker. At one point, I found myself picking up takeout because the kitchen was too much of a mess to cook in. As I ate alone in front of the TV, I wondered how long we could keep this up. But in those quiet moments, a small part of me began to feel the weight of my decision. It wasn't easy to sit back and let things fall apart, and I knew it wasn't easy for her either. Still, I justified it to myself as a necessary lesson. She needed to see that, just as she felt unappreciated, so did I. One evening, after another silent dinner, she finally broke the silence. "What exactly are you trying to prove here?" she asked, her tone more tired than angry. I looked at her, considering my words carefully. "I'm not trying to prove anything," I said. "I'm just giving you the space you wanted. If you're not my servant, I'm not your provider. We're equals, right? So let's both carry our weight." Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't respond immediately. Instead, she sat back, crossing her arms. I could tell she was mulling over my words, but I didn't push her. I'd planted the seed, now I just had to wait and see how it grew. After that conversation, things didn't exactly improve. If anything, the atmosphere in the house became even more tense. It wasn't just the silence between us, it was the visible disarray creeping into every corner of our daily lives. The routine we'd once relied on, even if imperfect, was now crumbling under the weight of our standoff. The first thing I noticed was how quickly the small, unspoken agreements we used to have began to unravel. Before, even without explicitly dividing tasks, we had some level of balance. I'd handle certain errands without being asked, and she'd take care of others. Now, everything was left in limbo. The trash sat for days, its smell growing worse until one of us couldn't stand it anymore. The sink overflowed with dirty dishes, and neither of us wanted to be the first to crack. I caught myself rinsing a single plate or cup just to eat, leaving the rest untouched as if admitting defeat. The mornings became the hardest part. She used to wake up early, making coffee for both of us before rushing off to work. Now, the coffee pot was empty when I came into the kitchen. I made my own, of course, but it was another sign of how far apart we'd grown. Her lunch, which I used to pack neatly on the counter, something I'd started doing for her early in our relationship, stopped too. When she finally asked why I'd stopped, I replied simply, "I figured you'd handle it." The evenings weren't much better. Coming home after work, I'd see her sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone or staring at the TV. The pile of laundry on the floor in the corner of the living room remained untouched for days. The mess wasn't just physical, it was emotional, and we were both drowning in it. At one point, we had an unspoken competition over who could last longer without breaking. I started ordering takeout for dinner almost every night, eating it straight from the container. She followed suit, microwaving frozen meals or grabbing leftovers from the fridge. One night, I came home to find her eating cereal out of a mixing bowl because all the regular bowls were dirty. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it, but I kept my composure. This wasn't the time to show weakness. Still, it was clear the strain was starting to affect her as much as it was affecting me. I saw it in the way her shoulders slumped a little lower every day, in the dark circles under her eyes. She wasn't saying it outright, but I could tell she was feeling the weight of managing everything herself. And yet, I stubbornly held my ground, telling myself this was the only way she'd understand my perspective. It wasn't just her, though. The longer this dragged on, the more I began to feel the toll it was taking on me too. The house, once a place of comfort, now felt like a battleground. Every room was a reminder of how far apart we drifted, unwashed dishes in the sink, unopened mail piling up on the counter, a layer of dust settling on furniture neither of us bothered to clean. The mess wasn't just external, it was seeping into the relationship itself, and the more I tried to ignore it, the harder it became to pretend everything was fine. The tension even began creeping into other parts of my life. At work, I found myself distracted, replaying our arguments and thinking about how to handle the next inevitable confrontation. My usual workouts at the gym felt half-hearted, the frustration I used to channel into lifting weights now lingering in the back of my mind. I realized I wasn't just angry at her. I was angry at myself too. Angry that I'd let it get to this point. Angry that I couldn't figure out how to fix it without feeling like I was losing, despite everything. There were moments where I caught glimpses of how much we were both struggling. One evening, I came home to find her sitting on the couch, with her head in her hands, visibly exhausted. For a split second, I thought about sitting next to her, maybe saying something to break the ice, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I walked past her, heading straight to the bedroom without a word. We were stuck in this vicious cycle, both of us too proud to admit we were wrong, both too stubborn to make the first move. And the longer it went on, the more I wondered how much more either of us could take. The breaking point came quietly at first, like a slow burn that neither of us fully acknowledged. Days had turned into weeks of this unspoken stalemate, and the tension in the house was now unbearable. We barely spoke unless it was necessary, and when we did, our words were clipped and filled with a weight of unspoken frustrations. It felt as though we were two strangers inhabiting the same space, each unwilling to take the first step toward reconciliation. One evening, I came home to find her sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by scattered bills and a calculator. The sight was oddly jarring. Normally, I was the one who handled the finances, keeping track of due dates and ensuring everything was paid on time. Now, the stack of envelopes was clearly overwhelming her. She didn't look up when I walked in, but her tense shoulders told me everything I needed to know. "Do you know we're late on the electric bill?" she asked, her tone sharp but tinged with exhaustion. "And the internet might get cut off tomorrow because no one paid it." I shrugged, leaning against the doorway. "I assumed you'd take care of it," I said, echoing her own words from our initial argument. Her head snapped up, and for the first time in weeks, I saw genuine anger in her eyes. "You assumed I'd take care of it," she repeated, her voice rising. "Are you serious right now? You're just going to let everything fall apart to prove a point?" "I'm not letting anything fall apart," I shot back, my own frustration bubbling to the surface. "I'm just doing what you said, letting you handle things instead of me stepping in all the time." "Oh, so this is about proving I can't do it, is that it?" She stood up, shoving the chair back with more force than necessary. "You're acting like a child, refusing to take responsibility for anything just because you're mad." Her words stung, but I wasn't about to back down, "and you're acting like you've been carrying this house all on your own when that's not even close to the truth," I said, my voice rising to match hers. "Do you even realize how much I do, or are you too busy keeping score?" "That's rich, coming from someone who hasn't lifted a finger in weeks," she snapped. "You think paying the bills means you're off the hook for everything else?" Newsflash, being a partner isn't just about money. The argument spiraled from there, both of us throwing out every grievance we'd been holding on to. It wasn't just about the current situation anymore, it was about every little thing that had ever gone wrong in our relationship. She accused me of being distant, of taking her for granted, of assuming she'd handle everything at home just because I was the breadwinner. I accused her of not appreciating how hard I worked, of expecting me to shoulder all the financial pressure without complaint, of failing to acknowledge the sacrifices I made for us. At one point, we were both shouting over each other, our voices echoing through the house. I don't even remember half the things we said, but I do remember the way her face crumpled when I told her, "If you think being a servant is bad, try being a provider for someone who doesn't even say thank you." The silence that followed was deafening. She stared at me, her expression a mixture of shock and hurt. For a moment, I thought she might cry, but instead she just shook her head. "You really think that's what this is about?" she said, her voice quieter now but no less intense. "You think I don't appreciate you? Do you even hear yourself?" Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of everything we'd been avoiding. I wanted to respond, to defend myself, but for the first time, I wasn't sure what to say. Instead, I just stood there, fists clenched at my sides, while she turned and walked out of the room. I heard the bedroom door slam a moment later, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something crack inside me. This wasn't just about pride anymore. This was about two people who had let their frustrations and misunderstandings push them to a breaking point. As I stood there in the empty kitchen, surrounded by unpaid bills and the echoes of our argument, I couldn't help but wonder if we'd gone too far to fix it. For the first time, it wasn't just tension, it felt like distance. Real, tangible distance. She avoided me whenever possible, staying in the bedroom longer in the mornings and coming home later at night. When we did cross paths, we barely exchanged more than a cold glance or a curt word. The house, once loud with shared laughter and conversation, had become a void. I told myself I was fine with it, that this was the natural course of things, that she would eventually see my point. But each day, as I walked into a house that felt emptier and more chaotic, I couldn't help but feel the gnawing sense that this was spiraling out of control. The breaking point came late one Thursday night. I had just come home from work, exhausted and hungry, to find that the fridge was almost entirely empty. I hadn't noticed before how much effort she had put into keeping things stocked and organized. It wasn't just the lack of food, it was the little things, like the absence of fresh fruit on the counter or the neatly arranged shelves in the fridge. Now, it was all a mess. A carton of expired milk sat in the corner. Half-forgotten leftovers crowded the bottom shelf, and the pantry was in disarray. That night, I rummaged through the cabinets and ended up eating plain toast and peanut butter for dinner. The simplicity of it struck me, not because it was bad, but because it felt so disconnected from what our life used to be. I sat alone at the kitchen table, chewing slowly, and felt the full weight of the mess we'd created. This wasn't just about pride anymore. This was about survival. She came home about an hour later. I could tell by the way she walked in that she was just as drained as I was. She glanced at me briefly before dropping her bag on the floor and heading toward the bedroom without a word. I wanted to say something to break the silence, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. What would I even say? Sorry for standing my ground. Sorry for expecting her to understand how I felt. The moment came the next morning. The tension had finally pushed its way into something unavoidable. I had forgotten to set the coffee maker the night before, a task she used to do for us both without fail. When she came into the kitchen, her face fell at the sight of the empty pot. She slammed her hand down on the counter, harder than necessary, and I snapped, "Is it really about the coffee now?" My voice was sharper than intended. She turned, eyes blazing. "It's not about the coffee," she shouted. "It's about everything. Look at this house. Look at us. We're living like roommates who hate each other." Her words cut deeper than I wanted to admit. She wasn't wrong, but the sting of hearing it out loud made me defensive. "Well, maybe if you stopped acting like this was all on me." "Don't," she interrupted, her voice lower but no less intense. "Don't you dare act like you've done nothing wrong in this. You think you're teaching me some kind of lesson, but all you've done is show me how much I can't rely on you." Her words felt like a slap, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. She stared at me, her chest rising and falling with the weight of her frustration, and I realized that this was no longer about proving a point. This was something much bigger, something we couldn't fix with another fight. I wanted to argue, to defend myself, but something about the look in her eyes stopped me. For the first time in weeks, I saw just how much this was affecting her. Us. She wasn't just angry, she was hurt deeply and profoundly, and it hit me that I wasn't the only one struggling under the weight of our pride. The rest of the morning passed in silence. She left for work without another word, and I sat at the table, staring at the coffee maker, wondering how things had gotten so out of control. For the first time, I began to question if this was about more than just chores and responsibilities. Maybe we had let the small things build up for so long that they had become something much larger, something neither of us knew how to face. That thought lingered with me all day. It wasn't just the house that was falling apart, it was us. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if we could put it back together. That day dragged on endlessly. I couldn't concentrate at work. Every email, every meeting felt like background noise compared to the turmoil in my head. Her words kept echoing, "You've shown me how much I can't rely on you." As much as I wanted to dismiss them as a heat-of-the-moment exaggeration, I couldn't. Deep down, I knew she meant it, and it stung because I'd never intended to make her feel that way. By the time I got home, the silence in the house was unbearable. The mess, the empty fridge, the pile of unopened mail. Everything screamed of how far we'd let this go. She was already home, sitting on the couch, scrolling aimlessly through her phone. She didn't even look up when I walked in. I dropped my bag by the door and stood there for a moment, unsure of how to approach her. My usual defensive walls were crumbling, replaced by something new, guilt. "Can we talk?" I finally asked, my voice breaking the heavy silence. She looked up, her expression guarded. For a moment, I thought she might brush me off, but she sighed and set her phone down. "Fine," she said, crossing her arms. "Talk." I sat down across from her, leaning forward with my elbows on my knees. I didn't know where to start, so I just went with the truth. This isn't working," I said, gesturing vaguely to the space between us. "I don't know what we're doing anymore, but it's not fixing anything." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "You think?" she said, her tone sharp. "Because from where I'm sitting, it feels like you've been more focused on proving a point than fixing anything." I flinched at her words but nodded. She was right, and it was time to own it. "You're not wrong," I admitted. "I thought if I stopped doing things, you'd see how much I contribute. But all I've done is make everything worse for both of us." Her arms uncrossed slightly, her posture softening just a bit. "So what, you're just now realizing that this isn't a game?" she asked, her voice quieter but still tinged with frustration. I shook my head. "No, I've known that for a while," I said. "I just didn't know how to stop. Every time I thought about stepping up again, I told myself I'd be giving in, and I didn't want to feel like I was losing." She let out a bitter laugh. "Losing what?" "Me. Because congratulations, you're on your way there." Her words hit like a punch to the gut. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to look her in the eye. "I don't want to lose you," I said, my voice cracking. "But I also don't want to keep living like this. We're tearing each other apart over things that don't even matter in the grand scheme of things." For the first time in weeks, I saw her expression soften completely. She leaned back against the couch, exhaling deeply. "So what do we do?" she asked. "Because I can't keep going like this either." It wasn't an easy question to answer. We sat there in silence for a few moments, both of us lost in thought. Finally, I said, "We need to stop keeping score, stop trying to figure out who's doing more or less. We're supposed to be partners, not opponents." She nodded slowly, her gaze distant. "But how? If it feels like we've been stuck in this pattern for so long." "I don't know," I admitted. "But maybe we start by being honest about what we need. No more assuming, no more resentment. Just say what we need from each other and figure it out together." She looked at me, her eyes searching my face for something. Maybe sincerity, maybe hope. "Okay," she said finally, "I need you to show me that you care. Not just by paying bills or doing chores, but by being present, by seeing me." I nodded, taking her words to heart. "And I need to feel like what I do matters," I said. "I need to know that you see how hard I work for us, even if it's not always obvious." For the first time in what felt like forever, she smiled faintly. "That seems fair," she said. "It wasn't a magical fix. We didn't suddenly fall into each other's arms or solve all our problems in one conversation, but it was a start. We spent the rest of the evening talking, really talking, about the things that had been festering between us. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't pretty, but it was real. By the end of the night, the house was still a mess, and the fridge was still empty. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like we'd taken a step toward cleaning up something far more important.